We are doing a Dcult Cult Awareness Conference takeover on this channel, highlighting artists that will be speaking at that conference in New Zealand. Today we have a very special guest, Anusha Bradley. She's an investigative journalist in New Zealand. She works for Radio New Zealand, regularly writes about topics you might expect: mental health care, environment, modern slavery, government oversight. But she spent most of 2023 working on the topic of Jehovah's Witnesses in New Zealand, producing features, news stories, and a podcast, examining the impacts of shunning, which our film Witness Underground talks deeply about. And also she gets into the church's practices and policies around child sex abuse, which is a huge topic. How are you doing, Anusha?
I'm really well, thank you.
What is your connection to it, and why was that an important topic of 2023?
Yeah, look, I have to admit that I did not really know anything about the Jehovah's Witnesses before the end of 2022. So I was approached just kind of out of the blue, really, by a couple of young former Jehovah's Witnesses who had recently left the church. They were from a small town or a city, really, in Hamilton, which is in the middle of the North Island, New Zealand. And they called me up and said, look, we really want to tell you about the Jehovah's Witnesses and what we went through. And I was like, well, okay, I didn't really know much about the religion. I knew that they went door knocking and preaching. I knew that they didn't like blood transfusions. And that was pretty much the extent of my knowledge about the religion. As I talked to them several times. I went and visited them and I got to know them really well. And I learned their story and what they went through. And then I learned about the impact of shunning, how it really, really had a catastrophic impact on their lives. Then I started talking to other people who had left the church, and the more I talked to people, the more I realized this was huge. And how did we not know about? How did the general public not know about this? I looked at overseas stories. There's been a wealth of stories written internationally about shunning, the impact on human rights. There's been lots of court cases even internationally, but really little had been done in New Zealand. We only have about 20,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in New Zealand, so it's a small population. But everyone I talked to had a traumatic story, whether it was being shunned and just not having any family left. They described it as the death of their entire family and community, or being abused and not being able to talk about it, it being not acknowledged and having to hide it. And that took me down a separate path into how the church deals with child abuse. So, it was a fascinating topic to explore. And I hope that through my series of stories that I published last year, that the aim was to raise awareness. And it came at a really interesting time in New Zealand because the government had launched an independent Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care. That's been going since 2019. And that's looking at people who suffered abuse at the hands of state care. That was then expanded in, I think, about 2020 to include all faith-based institutions. And the Jehovah's Witnesses were part of that, were included. And many, I think dozens of Jehovah's Witnesses gave evidence to the Commission about how they were treated in the religion when it came to abuse. And that final report is due to be released in the next few months. So we're all kind of waiting to see what this independent commissioner is going to say about the Jehovah's Witnesses and how they, I guess, systematically treat or cover up child abuse in the church. It's still really relevant.
There was one quote from one of your articles I read that said, this is the quote, "The Jehovah's Witness faith is the only group to oppose being involved," which is an interesting point. Like, it almost screams like, hey, we have a problem, like, don't look at us. What is your opinion on that?
So a lot of the churches that were involved in the commission, the Catholic Church, many, they all voluntarily have joined in the commission and agreed to be scrutinised by them. Last year, the Jehovah's Witnesses launched a court case, actually, saying, we want to get out of the commission. We have no part of this. We have no right to be scrutinised because we don't have children in our care. We don't have vulnerable people in our care. And they were referring to bricks and mortar kind of institutions. The commission pushed back against that, and the court agreed that actually they did have people in their care, and care as in pastoral care. So that went all the way to the High Court, actually, and last year the court agreed that they did have to take part in the commission of inquiry. So it's been really interesting times, and I think rightly, as you say, why don't they want to take part in it? It's sort of it raises a lot of questions about why they don't think they should be included in this.
Yeah, and it's something for the health of the entire country that
Absolutely.
all these different organizations are included in this investigation. Like, let's try to find out what's the problem right now in our society today. And they're like, no, you can't look at us.
From my dealings with the organisation, it was very hard to get answers from them.
From the active members.
Yes, so I had
Yeah.
to deal with the Australian headquarters, which oversees all New Zealand congregations, and it was very hard to get them. They refused to be interviewed multiple times. They didn't really answer my questions. They often gave quite conflicting information. It was a very opaque organisation to deal with, and everyone I talked to had left the organisation. Even I actually managed to speak to people who were still in the organisation as well, and but wanting to leave, but too scared to leave because of shunning. They all just described this opaqueness that it was very hard to get clear answers from the church.
Yeah. You did an excellent article, long form article called Something Evil about shunning, and the character, I think it's Rachel Jackson, says, I'm not sure, maybe the names are changed, but it says, the very threat of shunning causes serious long-term harm, and the practice, they say, is a breach of human rights. I believe that's you talking about her experience, which it's really interesting. Do you think that there's an angle besides the shunning causing long-term harm? Can you talk to that and what can be done in New Zealand, or what other groups, how they're handling that? And then also, is there something about human rights to be discussed here?
Those are two really interesting and important questions. So that was the aim of this article. The article really wanted to delve into the impact of shunning and what it did to people. And I just spoke to dozens of people who had just had such a traumatic time through that process. Many still have long-lasting trauma from it. The question of the question of, is there an abuse of human rights here? I was really interested in what was happening overseas with the case in Norway, where they had ruled that it was a breach of human rights, and other test cases around Europe had sort of had mixed results. In New Zealand, it has not been tested. We have quite different human rights laws. Some people I've talked to said yes, it could be argued that shunning is a breach of human rights, but other parts of the law also protect religious freedom, and it really just hasn't been tested. We don't know. So that is still up for debate in New Zealand.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in Norway, the Jehovah's Witnesses lost the case. They're no longer considered a religion, and the issue at hand was about human rights of children under the care of their parents, if they were to get punished with shunning, the full force of shunning. That would be a violation of their human rights, because they would be coerced into continuing the process and not having communication with their family as a minor. Something in that zone was like
exactly. It was all about to do with the children, and I did speak to people who were involved in that sort of campaign to find out more about it. And I think recently it went all the way to their top court, and the court agreed that the church did breach human rights there, and the Norwegian government has stripped the church of its right to collect sort of funding from the government. So yeah, really interesting.
You're going to be on the panel at Dcult this year. Do you know what you'll be talking about there? For anybody who's thinking about going to Christchurch to attend in New Zealand, and also for people who might buy the live streamed or the Dcult documentary that's coming out as well. Could you talk to what we should expect on the panel you're a part of, and also the Dcult in general?
Yeah, so Dcult is going to be a really interesting event. I'm really excited to be part of it. It's the first conference on cults in New Zealand, and Anka Richter, the organiser and a really great journalist, is behind it all and the driving force. I'm going to be chairing the panel focusing on the Jehovah's Witnesses in New Zealand, and I really hope by the time that the conference happens, we'll know the final outcome of the Royal Commission of Inquiry, their final report, and hopefully we'll know or have some directions to their thinking on what they think should happen with the Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'm really interested to delve into that topic. also talk to people like yourself and others on the panel about their experiences of shunning. And I'd really like to tackle this issue of human rights and what it might mean in New Zealand, in the New Zealand context as well as internationally, because it really comes down to how you interpret the law, and every country is slightly different. What can we do here in that space? So those are probably the broad things I'd love to talk about with you and others on the panel.
I'm looking forward to that. One thing, just to give some context, anyone who doesn't know, I'm very focused on this particular topic in space for the last few years with our film Witness Underground. And the activists who have been writing and speaking and organizing in the space for decades, the older they are, the more they're like, hey, all these other groups are doing similar control things and manipulation and coercion that are unhealthy for society in general. But they're patterns we can see repeated. And actually, it's not about this one group or this one form of abuse. It's about, it really comes down to human rights. And we need to get the governments to understand the nuanced way these types of groups manipulate, which I think I found very fascinating. And maybe you can get your opinion on that, like, direction. Do you see something like that in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I've realized by really looking into one particular religion, being the Jehovah's Witnesses, is that you can see threads of this coercion and control, not just in religions, but through wider society these days, especially since the pandemic. We're seeing the rise of misinformation, sort of types of coercion control through alternative or social media, and through, especially in the wellness industry. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Like, you can see threads of this, which I think is really dangerous. And interestingly, there is, I think it's really important because there is a lot of negativity around mainstream media generally about how they tackle these issues. And so I feel like it's a really important thing that we talk about this and build trust again in mainstream media to report on these kind of issues.
Yeah, how is you're in mainstream media as a journalist and in radio, kind of traditional media from last century. How has the rise of social media, YouTube, how has that affected your work and dissemination of valid information?
It's always a challenge. So at RNZ, Radio New Zealand, we also have a website, and we're moving more and more into the digital space with a whole range of products. So in the team that I work in the Investigative team, we try and have a story that covers all the platforms. So we'll do radio, we'll do web, we'll do video, we'll do podcasts. And that's a really great way of getting our stories out there, because what matters is the storytelling, and then we can adapt it to different platforms. And I think that's where we need to be more nimble. I think traditional mainstream media needs to adapt our storytelling to get the messages out there to all the different people who we maybe traditionally haven't met. And that's even more important nowadays.
Did you learn anything where you could draw some comparisons to what was happening in Australia with the Australian Royal Commission?
Yeah, so that was really interesting. So the Australian Royal Commission did a big study on the Jehovah's Witness there, which came out, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 2016 or 2018, so quite a while ago now. And they actually, the Commission in Australia really focused on a redress, like an apology system and a redress system, which I think has had mixed results in terms of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'm really interested in finding more about how that's worked in Australia and what New Zealand can learn from that in terms of the Jehovah's Witnesses here. The Commission in Australia was able to access thousands of documents from the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were able to find out that there had been, I think, thousands of victims of sexual abuse which had never been reported to the police. I don't know what the Commission in New Zealand, I don't know if they did something similar or what their approach was. It's really, we haven't been given a lot of information about what they're doing about the Jehovah's Witnesses, or what kind of information they've got from them. The fact that the Jehovah's Witnesses in New Zealand took the Commission to court to get out of that scrutiny suggests that maybe they haven't been so forthcoming with some information. We really be really interesting to find out and read that final report and see what is has been addressed here in New Zealand compared to Australia, for sure.
When I started doing my research for my film, Witness Underground, I started following every activist that came up, that popped up, or that found, and most of them on YouTube, but there's a lot of other places and podcasts and blogs. And something came out right during the Royal Commission around that. It was a couple of years after the results came out. And that had a huge effect on the former Jehovah's Witness community, those reports. But there was there's always someone who's leaking information. There's some elder inside, or they call them physically and mentally out. So they're like PMO, they call it, physically and mentally out. And they might stay in to maintain their relationships, but also they're playing both sides like a spy information in the information wars. So there's always the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses sending out documentation to the next hierarchy, and then they send out the thing to the next hierarchy. So elders would get this packet of information every once in a while. And one of those things that was leaked was, hey, this letter was sent to all congregations in the entire world. And it was right after the Royal Commission, and it said something like, all files on anyone who's no longer associated with religion, or it was something like super broad, but not really, it wasn't obviously tied to the results, but I'm making connections. So, and I don't know, right? Like I found a piece of paper on the internet. So take that for what it is in terms of valid information. But basically it was saying like, destroy all the files around the whole world. And so when they do that kind of thing, the local elders who are in charge at that time, because they get deleted from their positions. Other people get appointed if they don't follow the rules or whatever. So if that happened, I mean, that's like, there won't be evidence because they destroyed the evidence that they had, but they had a file on everybody. Like when you move from one congregation to the next, and I did this a bunch when I was in the religion, you're supposed to, if you're in good standing, if you want respect, you have to like call your local elders and have them send it to your new address, and then they'll have a meeting with you, and they'll do an additional report on you, and then that file stays with you as a person. And at some point I was like, I don't like that, feels gross, and I like stopped moving it around before finally leaving. And this is in my 20s. But those reports I think are gone now. And
Wow. Okay.
I saw you were reporting, or one of your articles discussed what the elders' rules are about reporting on child sex abuse. And yeah, just, I don't know if you can speak to any of
The
that.
record keeping was a fascinating insight for me into the religion, because it was actually crucial. It really helped my reporting. So what I was able to do is I was able to tap into a network of former secretaries. So they were congregation secretaries who were really the key people in a congregation. They had access to all the paperwork, and many of them, when they left, they kept it all. So I was really lucky to be able to find quite a few people who had stores of documents about their former congregation. And being the kind of people they were secretaries, they were very organized. It was all, all filed, all kept. And that was how I was able to prove that child abuse allegations were covered up, that some congregations had active child abusers within the congregation still, and congregants didn't know about this. Those documents were really crucial. And the document you're referring to, which came out, I think, days after that Royal Commission report, was very vaguely worded, but insinuated that, yes, documents should be destroyed. The Royal Commission in New Zealand issued a moratorium saying, do not destroy anything. But then, how are they going to know? We don't know. We just don't know.
Yeah.
And I did hear allegations that documents were destroyed. It's very hard to prove, but yeah, it's very concerning that some people I spoke to who are still in the organisation, who are still congregants, they know of child abusers who are in the congregation. They know harm they have caused, but they also know that documents about what they did has been destroyed. So it's a really troubling and quite fascinating, but also very disturbing kind of aspect of the religion, for sure.
Yeah. To give some personal angle on that, the congregation I grew up in, I had multiple people tell me that they had been abused, but like they were telling me as like a young teenage boy about this, and I didn't know what to do. And there's a crazy secret keeping aspect to a very Orwellian structure to the society. And almost like playing therapy in that situation and not knowing what that means and knowing that therapy is bad. And, there's all this complexity to it. But also later found out that the first person I worked for in the religion, the wife had been abused as part of a child sex ring. And all those people one of them had gone to jail, but like it was like a whole group of men who were in charge of this group of like doing things to kids. And one of them went to jail, and found out years later, we didn't know that then, but I found out years later that one of those guys was like, we grew up with him and in our congregation. And everyone in the congregation knew that he had just been relocated to our congregation to hide and to like kind of diffuse the drama of the child sex abuse problem. And our family had just joined. So my parents raised us 5 kids around a pedophile our whole lives, and no one said a word about it. And they all knew. And since now that I'm like out of the religion and I'm talking to people all over the world about this topic, I have not yet met someone who didn't know a pedophile or didn't know someone or didn't have a pedophile in their congregation. So it's like, and Australia is such a great example of doing great investigation that is kind of really peeling back the layers and showing us what's real, because they found 1,006 known named perpetrators with more than twice that of victims. So on average, like 2 victims per perpetrator, and none of them were ever reported. So and that's just one country on a global religion. And Pennsylvania's coming off, New Zealand's coming up right now with their investigation and finding real problems, finding real people, convicting real criminals.
I think the key to that is that what I realize is that the systems and processes and policies of the Jehovah's Witness religion, they're globalized. So they all follow the same processes. They all have the same policies. They're all dictated from the headquarters in the US. So if that happened in Australia, it's very, very likely that a similar situation is in New Zealand and elsewhere, because they all follow the same processes. And that was a real eye-opener to me. And I guess when I started looking into the child abuse policies, that was in the back of my mind, thinking, okay, I know what's happened in Australia. By the fact that they follow the same policies and processes, this must be the same case in New Zealand. And so I really wanted to try and prove that. I obviously couldn't, but that was in the back of my mind with my reporting and what I wanted to show, especially at the time the church was trying to get out of the commission as well. So it felt really important to try and prove that this was an issue here as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you for doing work. I was curious if you had any affiliation with the religion. You've cleared that up, that you're had no knowledge and you entered and learned about this. And that's really valuable to people in that group, myself included, because it feels like nobody's paying attention to this bigger problem. And my focus has been on shunning, but it's very personal. So thank you for putting the time in and doing valuable work for the community, the global community.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the channel. Can you give any final words about Dcult and how important that is for New Zealand?
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating conference, fascinating couple of days. We've got a range of topics, a range of international speakers about cults and deculting. And I think it's a really interesting opportunity. It's the first time a conference like this has been held in New Zealand, and it's a really good opportunity for people who work in the mental health sector, who are survivors, who maybe government agencies that need to be aware of these issues, to come together and learn and talk and connect. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to meeting people and seeing the connections grow.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to meeting you there. Everyone come down to Dcult if you can make it to Christchurch. And if you can't, buy the ticket for the live stream. Pay attention to the Dcult conference, and we'll see you there.